So good morning, everyone. Welcome. We are going to get started in about 5 minutes. So thank you for joining us. I see we've got about 4 or 5 attendees already dialed in here. We'll get started shortly. Thanks. So while we're waiting to begin, I'll use these 2 minutes to shamelessly plug some future CONECT events. So we have a great group of attendees today, and if any of you are not members of CONECT, you should be. So you can visit connect.org and join us. I think one of the best benefits of membership right now are these 10 a.m. Tuesday morning phone calls that we're having, where members join in. We get a briefing from Ray here, a legislative update every week. Members talk about what's happening in supply chain and transportation and trade compliance. It's a really great opportunity to hear from your peers, share best practices, and just generally have a shoulder to cry on these days with respect to what's happening on the transportation front. We also have a port tour coming up, looking at my notes here, on August 18th. It'll be great to be back in the saddle there again and have everybody face to face. We've got our annual Trade and Transportation Conference, December 7th through the 9th in Newport this year. So it's a little earlier than usual. So mark your calendars there. We hope you'll join us. And then at a future Tuesday 10 a.m. Phone call on one of those, we're going to have a private members only briefing on the 21st century customs framework from 2 CBP directors, give you an opportunity to hear what's happening there and share your feedback with the folks from CBP too. So I see we have attendees still streaming in here, and I know we do have several registrants that aren't going to be able to make it today, but are going to use the recording at a later date. So we've got a ton to share with you. We're gonna dive right in. So good afternoon and welcome. This is CONECT's latest in our series of trade compliance webinars. My name's Karen Kenny, as it says underneath my little block there. I'm the president of K2 Trade Solutions and the chair of CONECT. Thanks for joining us. We're going to kick things off fairly quickly, as I said. We've got a ton of great information to share with you, including a cameo appearance from CONECT's own Ray Buhager, who's joined us here today. Just some quick housekeeping notes. Today's webinar is sponsored by New England Duty Drawback Specialists, our own Bob Keneally. I'm going to type Bob's contact information into the chat box, and if you need drawback support, you can reach out to him directly. As I mentioned, today's webinar is being recorded. As I said, I know several folks registered, aren't able to join in person, and will be looking forward to watching the recording. And everyone who registered for the event will receive a link to the recording later. If you have questions, you can use the chat box. Our moderator, Betty Robson, will be monitoring it and handing off questions to our panelists throughout the event. As I mentioned, we've got a couple of events coming up, Port Tour on August 18th and our Trade and Transportation Conference December 7th through the 9th in Newport. So mark your calendars and plan to join us in person. It will be great to see everybody's smiling faces. So we're going to dive in. With us to help wade through the considerable amount of noise and tell us what we really need to know about the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act is Ray Buhager. Ray is a partner with FBB Federal Relations, working alongside our own Peter Friedman to support CONECT in New England trade. So with that, I will hand it off to you, Ray.
Great, thanks, Karen. I appreciate the opportunity here. So on June 8th, the United States Senate passed the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act of 2021. This is a big piece of legislation that has attracted a lot of attention, and it's because there's a lot in it. The legislation was championed by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer of New York and Indiana Senator Todd Young, and includes $250 billion to enhance scientific research, advance the development of artificial intelligence, and boost advanced manufacturing in the US. It also includes issues related to supply chains, intellectual property, and cybersecurity. The notable thing about this bill, well, one of the notable things, is that it passed the Senate by a vote of 68 to 32. A lot of people believe that this could be the only meaningful bipartisan legislation that the Senate takes up this year. It's only June, but it's possible. In this case, Democrats and Republicans were united behind a mutual interest, and that's to stop the growing threat that they see coming from China on the economic and national security front. A late addition to the bill was a package of international trade provisions that was included or put together by Senate Finance Committee Chairman Ron Wyden of Oregon and Ranking Member Mike Crapo of Idaho. The Wyden-Crapo package does a number of things. First, the legislation would extend the Generalized System of Preferences Program, GSP, through January 1st, 2027. And in addition, with respect to GSP, the bill would enhance enforcement mechanisms related to human rights, gender, and the environment, among other things. In addition, the legislation includes the Miscellaneous Tariff Bill, the MTB, which is a collection of duty suspensions and reductions that would expire on December 31st of 2023. The trade package that Wyden and Crapo put together also includes a thing that a lot of companies are interested in, and that's the Section 301 exclusion process. In fact, the bill includes three things with respect to the Section 301 exclusion process. First, the legislation requires USTR to reinstate China 301 exclusions that were granted under the Trump administration, but which have expired. It's worth noting here that there seems to be a lack of agreement as to whether this applies to all of the exclusions that expired or only those exclusions that expired on December 31 of 2020. The ambiguity here seems to be due in part to the fact that the bill was really thrown together rather quickly and at the last minute when both Wyden and Crapo saw an opportunity to attach it to the larger bill. The legislation also requires USTR to initiate an exclusion process for China tariffs, and generally creates a process for exclusions for USTR to follow when imposing tariffs pursuant to future Section 301 investigations. In addition to the pure trade items, the legislation also includes items related to forced labor. The bill formally establishes a forced labor division within CBP's Office of Trade, and it directs CBP to work with NOAA to specifically prevent the import of seafood that's either been harvested or produced using forced labor. The bill also addresses barriers to digital trade, protects intellectual property rights, and enhances supply chain security. Like I said at the beginning, there was a lot of excitement when the US Innovation and Competition Act passed the Senate. But the question is, what happens next? With respect to the larger bill, and really the trade package in particular, it's not entirely clear. The fact is that there are a number of disagreements on a number of levels between Democrats and Republicans, and between House and Senate. We know the US House of Representatives will need to take up and pass its own bill before a final package can be sent to the president. But House leaders have already said that they have their own ideas about what should be included in the bill. And those ideas don't necessarily match what's in the Senate bill. And while Senator Schumer has made this bill a priority since the beginning of the year, I just don't see the same sense of urgency over in the House. This lack of alignment is also specific to the trade piece. With respect to GSP, House Democrats, they just don't think that the Senate bill goes far enough with respect to human rights and the environment. On the MTB front, there are provisions in the Senate bill that numerous House members have objected to. And normally with the MTB process, if a House member objects, it gets thrown out. And on China tariffs, there's some hesitancy by congressional Democrats to get ahead of the Biden administration here or undermine their efforts to secure commitments from China. I think a lot of you probably know that the White House is currently leading a review of China policies that were enacted under the previous administration. And the president and his cabinet have been pretty clear. They're going to keep the China tariffs in place while they conduct that review. The fact is that while the bill included provisions that would require USTR to reinstate the exclusions that expired and implement a new process for allowing companies to request new exclusions, we understand those provisions were really included at the behest of the Republicans in the Senate, not necessarily the Democrats. I think you're going to see this dynamic play out today. I don't think it's been introduced yet, but House Ways and Means Democrats are planning to drop a bill that would extend GSP, re-up the MTB, extend trade adjustment assistance, which expires at the end of the month. But I don't think that they're going to include the China 301s. That's not to say that there isn't frustration amongst the Democrats in Congress with the administration on China 301s, but they're expressing that frustration to the administration behind the scenes while trying to be publicly aligned with the president. Bottom line is, with respect to the trade stuff and the overall bill, I think we've got a ways to go. If congressional leaders manage to get a bill to the president's desk this year, I think it's going to be much later this year. And it's only going to be after a very long, messy, bicameral and bipartisan negotiation.
All right. Thanks, Ray. Appreciate the update. As always, you've come through for us, even with my last minute invitation this time around. Ray's been a long time friend of CONECT, and we've made him an honorary New Englander. So we appreciate.
And I'm happy to be an honorary New Englander. And I don't know that I've ever made a cameo, so I appreciate that opportunity.
It's a first. Fantastic. Thanks a ton, Ray. We appreciate it. So now I'd like to introduce you to our moderator today, so we can dive into our main program. With us is Betty Robson. Betty is president of JF Moran, a customs broker and freight forwarder that's based here in New England. Betty's a licensed broker, a master customs specialist, and an attorney admitted to practice in the Court of International Trade. She's an associate professor of graduate studies in global trade at Johnson & Wales and a board member of Women in World Trade. And if that's not enough, I could keep going. Just know that between Betty and the wealth of talent and expertise of the women on this panel here today, you folks are in really great hands. And I hope you enjoy the webinar and learn a ton. Betty?
Thanks, Karen, and thanks, Ray. Ray, I did see in the question and answer before we get started that one of our attendees had asked if you could just repeat the GSP expiration date before we
Yeah,
get
sure thing, Ray.
started.
Yeah, January 1st of 2027 for GSP.
All right, thank you so much. And thanks so much for leaving the question for everybody in attendance. If you can use the chat box, it's easier for me to just try to monitor one or the other. So I greatly appreciate that. And I'm looking forward to getting started and hearing from this amazing panel. We're joined today with Brenda Smith, who is the retired Executive Assistant Commissioner of the Office of Trade at CBP. We have Carrie Hawley, the Manager of Global Customs Compliance for the Rockport Company. And we have Suzanne Ricker, Speaker, Author, and Director of E2Open's Global Trade Academy. And among these three women is a wealth of knowledge and some real hands-on and practical information for all of us. So we're going to start today listening to some of the things that Carrie can share with us in her experience as a customs compliance manager for the Rockport Company. So Carrie, how do you manage to stay informed in this ever-changing and very disruptive landscape in the world of compliance?
Well, thanks, Betty. Yeah, first, it definitely is an ever-changing landscape. And I think that staying informed and making sure that key stakeholders are informed is one of the most important parts of managing compliance, though admittedly it is one of the hardest. This includes both staying informed of what's happening with a company's own transactions, as well as staying up to date about challenges and opportunities that are affecting the trade or a specific commodity. From an importer's perspective, while I do sometimes use my broker's portal, my main source for staying informed of what's happening with my company's entries and duty payments and ISF timeliness is Customs ACE portal. Using ACE, I find that I can more efficiently access current information, particularly if I'm using more than one broker. Plus it's free and it's the same information that Customs sees. I know that most importers are familiar with ACE, though I do want to mention some features that I found helpful because using the site isn't always the most intuitive experience. So first and foremost, I do like to make sure that my mode of communication is set up so that Customs sends notices about CF 28s and 29s and any redelivery notices, both by mail and through the portal. This is particularly important if you're not in a corporate office every day to receive physical mail. And while you should still receive communication from Customs by email, I found that that's not always the case. So I like to have this fail-safe in place. For monitoring importer security filing, timeliness, and compliance, the timeliness reports are actually, instead of being with the traditional reports, they're actually over in the ISF website. And that can be found through the references tab on the ACE portal. I also do use general ACE reports that I have automated to send to my inbox. Some of my favorite canned reports that are available. There is one for CF 28s and 29s and one for late filed entry summaries. And then I also use courtesy notices of liquidation and recon no files. And that's helpful if your company files reconciliation entries. And there's also the ability to set up ad hoc customized reports too. So when it comes to staying informed of events affecting the trade, because time constraints are always a factor, I utilize a variety of free newsletters that are fed to my inbox from trade attorneys and associations and consultancy firms, as well as weekly industry association calls. I know Karen mentioned earlier, CONECT really does have a terrific weekly call for members that I do attend. And I also listen in on a call hosted by a commodity-specific trade association too. So So some of my most important sources outside of this are government resources from customs and partner government agencies, which also, have the added benefit of being free too. I think that many importers are signed up to receive CSMS messages from these agencies, but there really is a wealth of information outside of this. Customs website, for example, has a lot of information about their future vision and their 21st century customs framework, as well as information about priority trade issues like anti-dumping and forced labor, intellectual property rights. And within their trade and stakeholder engagement area, that's where you'll find notes from the COAC, which is, for those who aren't familiar, it's the Commercial Customs Operations Advisory Committee, as well as free webinars and trainings and notices about their trade symposiums and local trade days that they have. Last month, for example, I actually attended a free webinar that was titled "What's New with Shoes?" And they talked about tech-enabled footwear, and they also talked about leather flocking on outsoles as opposed to the traditional textile flocking that you'll find on outsoles. And usually, if you're signed up for CSMS messages, you'll also receive information about these events there too. So, aside from these, like many of you, I do utilize industry conferences and social media. I also really pay close attention to any congressional news and hearings like what Ray was talking about earlier. I'm really keyed in on what's happening with the miscellaneous tariff bill and GSP. Anyway, thanks for the question, Betty.
No, and I think that that's really helpful, especially to so many of our attendees there's so much information that comes at us, and to hear straight from you what you prioritize in terms of information sources is incredibly helpful.
Thanks.
And with all of that, right, that seems like a job in itself, but we know that that's not the only thing that you're doing there. So how do you balance all of the constraints and the pressures of compliance with the need to look at things like duty savings?
Sure. Now you're right, and it is challenging to balance everything. When you're buried with managing compliance requirements, it really can be tough to find ways to save money on duties and fees. But so when time is really tight, I tend to try to look for quicker hit opportunities that I can do without a lot of time spent. So a couple of examples of ones that I've used. Well, first is vessel level entry clearances. So it can sometimes be beneficial to clear several shipments from the same vessel under one entry to save merchandise processing fees. This is related to the minimum and maximum MPF for formal entries, which is based on the value of the goods. If your combined value is frequently over $153,000, it might be worthwhile to look into this, and if it's feasible, set up an exception process with your broker to combine shipments when the value is exceeded and clear the goods under one entry. And the savings, depending on your volume and typical entered value, it really can be significant if you're frequently over that dollar value. But it is important to carve out a process for hot shipments. That way they don't get linked in with an exam if the lot goes on exam. So another thing is if you import a commodity that can benefit from tariff engineering, I like to use reverse ruling searches through customs cross system. So by doing this, you can see modifications that other importers are making to lower their duty and stay aware of duty saving trends that are out there. How I've historically gone about this is I identify lower duty HTS numbers within a specific commodity, and then I look through more recent rulings and either search for patterns or language that customs uses in their ruling that describes their rationale for classification under that tariff number. One example, given that I work for a footwear company, is 6405-2090, where you'll find many rulings for boots and other shoes with, again, leather flocking on the outsoles. And when it qualifies on certain types of footwear, it can lower the duty from 37.5% to 12.5%. And there's also no 301 tariffs on that. Another example is the classic trend for adding a permanent cubic zirconia to costume jewelry. If you search by 7116-20500, you'll find a ton of rulings where importers are sending in their jewelry to see if their cubic zirconia, and see if that qualifies. A strong word of caution, though, it really is very important to understand the details around the rationale when utilizing tariff engineering at any time. And requesting your own binding ruling can really help with this before you spend time and dollars on production changes, and just making sure that you are correct and that you're being compliant.
Those are great practical tips. I'm sure everyone's busy, jotting down their notes or typing them right in. So thank you for that. And we know that you don't operate in a silo, right? Because, as the compliance manager for Rockport, you've got a lot of other folks who are working alongside you in different parts of the business. How do you get buy-in from stakeholders?
Sure. Well, I mean, I don't have a magic wand, especially when additional costs are involved or additional resources are needed to comply with a new regulation, or even when there's duty savings opportunities. If there's an initial outlay, there can be a lot of hesitation. But I do find that it's much easier to have these conversations when, especially with new regulations, when I've been keeping key stakeholders informed all along as news and events are unfolding. So if I'm staying informed and keeping others informed, these conversations are much easier. Equally important is really just partnering with them, listening to what their concerns are, and trying to find win-win solutions where, yes, we have to comply, but we want to make this as pain-free and cost-effective as possible. And lastly, I found that taking a phased-in approach where your focus is on really one small step at a time can sometimes soften the resistance that you can get.
Very smart advice for all of us. All right, so Carrie, thank you so much. We're going to move on for right now. I'm sure we're going to come back to you with questions, but we're going to move on with a few questions for Suzanne right now. And Suzanne's going to give us another perspective. And we're really going to start to consider how risk plays a role in what we're doing on a daily basis. So Suzanne, what types of risk models apply in this world of compliance?
Thank you, and thank you for having me join everyone today. And risk is certainly a key topic, always, even if it's not at the top of our agendas on a day-to-day basis. We're seeing so many changes today with supply chain disruptions, the Suez Canal, other port congestion, as well as even strikes. And all of those things are causing impact on supply chains. So when we talk about different risk models, companies really need to seek to have a tailored approach to their risk model. And that risk model should be written and developed and reviewed annually at a minimal basis. One for the import transactions, one for exports, one for your cargo security programs, such as CTPAT or AEO or PIP or any other program you're participating in. And then certainly one for supply chain resiliency at a minimum. And, just to talk a little bit about this and to expand on the concept, risk modeling and risk requirements really fall under the internal control process. And many of us who've been in the industry a long time are familiar with the internal control 5 requirements, the management commitment, a risk model, and then control activities, information and communication, which Carrie just expanded on, and monitoring. Though the interesting part is that if we don't manage the risk or we don't document it, then our control activities are not reflective of that risk. We could have many good control activities in place, but not necessarily focused in on the risk that we've identified. And that always begins with data. So obviously taking advantage of your ACE account, assuming you have one, and using that data to first look at what does your company look like on paper to customs. So often when I work with big companies or small companies, they'll say, you know what, we're doing great. We haven't heard from anyone. I think we haven't had a CF28 in a while, and they're all excited about that. But realistically, behind the scenes, that ACE data is being electronically evaluated. And of course, we have the Centers of Excellence and Expertise today, and they're virtual teams that are looking at commodity-specific environments. And it's always important to remember with the CEEs that they're not only judging you against your importing or exporting history, they're judging your company against your competitors, because they're looking at an industry and they see far more today than even 10 or 15 years ago. So I think the risk model must be tailored to your company. You should be looking at total imported value, the number of shipments, the type of shipments, the use of service providers, census warnings. Many people are so accommodated or used to seeing a census warning, or they don't even know they have them because the broker solves the problem by asking a question. It's transmitted to customs. And yet a census warning, whether on the import or export side, is an indicator. And it indicates that the information you shared may not be incorrect, but it's perceived as unlikely to be accurate. So a lot of companies in their risk models are managing the census warnings or monitoring them as part of their overall strategy. And sometimes there's other indicators of how quickly you grow when you change from 50 entries a year to 500, when you start to escalate from 2 million imported to more than 10 million, which makes you in the top 9,000 companies in this country importing or exporting. So these are all factors and trends, and they should be analyzed ideally over a 5-year period. So every year you're adding another year of data and you're looking at how your risk has changed. And then from that risk, of course, the control activities begin to take a place. So every control activity that I have, every standard operating procedure, every policy should be tied to that risk model. We know things. Many of us have been in the industry a long time, and we know, for example, that our entry summaries need to be accurate and that we need to have certain controls. But again, if they're not directly tied to risk, your company's not really taking advantage of that information and creating a best practice or a strategic company, process that drives compliance and reduces risk in the supply chain and reduces other areas. And then, another one, even in our cargo security. So we're looking at common elements. I'll take country of origin as an example. We look at country of origin for our imports, for our exports, and for our cargo security programs. But that single element drives different processes. For example, if I'm importing, I'm looking most likely at forced labor, tariff wars. I'm looking at factors that can impact me. If I'm looking at origin from a cargo security perspective, then I should be analyzing it differently. Is this country going to drive risk in terms of terrorism? Is it a country of interest per se? Does it have money laundering issues associated with that country? Is that country going to have political strife? And how is that going to impact me? So the same elements will be digested, so to speak, and analyzed differently depending on the type of risk model I'm developing. And so it's an important piece of the puzzle.
It sure is. And, I think it probably has the same effect on me and many of our attendees, where we heard from Carrie talking about, how wonderful compliance is and how you can balance that with the need to look for duty savings. And then we jump right into risk, and the hairs on the back of my neck are standing straight up. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, risk, duty savings, is there something that we should talk about here? So are there risks associated with that quest, that never-ending quest to find duty savings?
Well, there's always a risk with the never-ending quest to reduce duties, and the key concept is to make sure that those deductions or reductions are legal. Always number one. When we think about free trade agreements, there's more than 180 free trade agreements globally today. We've shifted from NAFTA to the USMCA, where there's similar concepts from one trade agreement to the other, the tariff shift concept and regional value content, but still the documentation required around it isn't always secured timely, or maybe secured after the fact, or some companies with 2,000 to 2,500 or more suppliers may have difficulty always without technology or some other internal or external resource to apply and make sure that they qualify for the free trade agreement, legal deduction. And then other areas, I think when we go back to free trade agreements, first you classify, then you qualify. So if your classification is wrong, then your free trade agreement qualification process will be off. So there's always going to be risks in this area. And I think it's inherent that becomes part of your risk model. And from the risk model, you can create an auditing program, a monitoring program, a certain percentage of those files. Maybe if you're going to be using a new free trade agreement, that's going to be a big one. I think Ray mentioned, with this new GSP extension to 2027, how exciting is that? But interestingly, that's a difficult, there's two types of free trade agreement models, and GSP represents a different type. And that's based off a percentage of, local or regional value input. And often that requires records that go far above and beyond what companies are actually maintaining, including production records back at the supplier site, proof of input, that they ordered local materials, that they received them, that they paid for them. There's a tremendous amount of documents that are needed in support of that. And an interesting caveat for our listeners today is, in most of these, like GSP, I think is 35% or more regional content, local content. Your invoices should not say 100% from this country, because if you say 100%, then customs will audit you to 100%. And if your statement is only 85, you're technically still eligible, but you said 100. So now you find yourself in this place you don't want to be. So ideally, if that country's requirement is 35% or more, then your invoices should simply state 35% or more. And that way you're making the minimum. And if you get more than that in an audit, you're gold. So again, areas of risk and how we state things on the invoice are crucial to managing the risk forward. And I think, since we have a lot of different players in the CONECT world, another concept is, if you're in different parts of supply chain, if you're in purchasing or any other portion not trade compliance, everything that you do is up until the moment of the product arriving. We have to remember that with trade compliance, everything they do is from the moment it arrived and cleared, and now they're liable for the next 5 years, specifically in the US. We have to maintain those records, and we're subject to inquiries from customs for 5 years on the import and export side. So understanding the differences there is important, because most of everyone else in the supply chain has long forgotten about the transaction, where trade compliance now kicks in. So I'm excited that Carrie's still excited about trade compliance.
Right, and that you're not scaring everyone away, because all this talk of risk, right, can be, it can be very challenging. Is there one piece of advice that you give frequently to importers and exporters to help them reduce risk?
I think the one crucial thing around trade is, when we hear so often, everything's changing, and there are a lot of things changing. I'd like to remind people, though, that the fundamentals, 99% of the fundamentals do not change. And if you're not good with the fundamentals, then everything will appear problematic. So always get back to the fundamentals. A great overlooked part of the import regulations, 19 CFR 141.89, additional commercial invoice requirements. So often we fail to see the basic information on a commercial invoice when auditing that is required for a specific commodity, such as steel or chemicals, requiring the CAS number. That CAS number is often missing. So there's much to juggle in this world with the inclusion of forced labor in so many different pieces of legislation, as Ray mentioned, and also in free trade agreements and other arenas, and now tariff wars and so forth. But if your fundamentals aren't under control, everything will become a little bit more difficult.
So true. Thank you, Suzanne. I'm sure that we will be back to you with some questions too. But we're going to move on and hear from Brenda, because now that we've heard about the compliance side and some of the risks associated with programs, you know, it would be really great to hear more about the ways in which the legislative and regulatory environment may provide some good reason to devote our precious resources to beef up our compliance efforts. So Brenda, I'm hoping that you can share some insight with us. If we start with the current priorities of CBP and the new administration, I think that we'd all really appreciate hearing that from you.
Sure. Thanks very much, Betty. It's a tough act to follow. Both Carrie and Suzanne did a really great job of walking through so many of the basics and what you can do with the resources available to you. It can seem overwhelming at times. Often, as I talked to groups, I would note that CBP was responsible for enforcing 500 different laws on behalf of 50 agencies. And if you're a broker or you're an importer or exporter trying to be compliant, I have to believe that those numbers are just daunting. They really seem like, well, why should I even start? And I think that there are some tools that you can use, and Carrie and Suzanne both walk through some really good, both tactical and strategic tools. What I'd like to give a little bit of insight into is from the CBP perspective, how they prioritize what they're going to look at. Because I think that if we all have an understanding of where the most important things in the trade environment really reside, then we can work together to focus on those issues. And so the first thing that I would call out are, in fact, CBP's longstanding priority trade issues. You all, I hope, can reel them off. I have embarrassed myself in a number of forums by not being able to reel them off, but they are things like intellectual property rights protection, free trade agreement enforcement. Forced labor is not yet a priority trade issue, but I think it's certainly something that CBP will be considering. You also have issues like agriculture, textile and apparel, general revenue issues, and import safety. All of these are priorities for Customs and Border Protection, whether you're talking about the Centers of Excellence and Expertise or the CBP officers at the ports of entry or the folks that are running headquarters programs. There's a tremendous amount of planning at CBP every year that looks at not only the strategic issues that the agency needs to address and spend resources on, but also on the tactical issues. How are we going to spend our enforcement resources? And very often the conversation is around those priority trade issues. Now, Carrie already called out the CBP website, and I'm so pleased that she did. I would be the first to tell you that it can sometimes be hard to find information on the website because there is so much of it. But I know most of you are trade geeks like I am, and you know your way around a good trade compliance website. And I would point you to the description and the resources associated with the priority trade issues on cbp.gov. I think that's where I would start if I was building a risk model like Suzanne talked about. I think another area to pay attention to are the administration and the congressional policy goals or areas of interest. We just heard a really great run through of the China Competitiveness Act by Ray. And I think he called out a number of issues that the congressmen and senators are very interested in having CBP focus on. I can't tell you the number of conversations that I had when I was still at CBP with various congressional staff and members around things like forced labor. or the effective enforcement of anti-dumping and countervailing duty orders on behalf of their constituents. That gets CBP's attention. When a congressman or a congressional staff is asking, well, what are you doing in this area? CBP, excuse me, wants to be sure that they are paying good attention. And so when you are reading the newsletters that you read, or you get a brief by Ray or Peter Friedman, and they say, well, this week, Congress took up action on X bill, and it's focused on, for example, cotton coming out of Xinjiang. You know that CBP is likely to be asking questions in that area. As Betty, you pointed out, the Biden administration, when they came in, they were very clear on what their priorities were. And they focused very much on a worker-centric trade policy, and one that was sensitive to sustainability and to the environment. And I know many of us were asking ourselves, well, what does that mean? How does that translate into my world? But I think over the last couple of months, what we've seen is the things that we deal with all the time. Free trade agreements that have labor value content. Now, granted, that's new under the USMCA, but those types of mechanisms where there already are labor-related issues or environmental issues like illegal logging and the Lacey Act, those are things that if the administration is focused on them, you can bet CBP is going to be focused on them. I also think that paying attention to what CBP puts out on its website, whether it's the educational webinars or the newsletters. There's something called the Trade News Snapshot that comes out once a quarter or so that highlights accomplishments that CBP has made recently. That can give you insight into what they're focused on. Also, look at the press releases that CBP puts out or the press conferences that it held. In January, between November and January, I think I did 4 separate press conferences on forced labor issues. So you know that's a big one for CBP. Also see what CBP personnel are speaking about at conferences. Lots of compliance information provided by trade association. And if a CBP representative takes the time to come and speak to a large group about a particular issue, you can bet it's on their radar screen. The last thing I want to ask you to do, in addition to paying attention to all of these very detailed issues, is make sure you're talking to CBP. There's a lot of times CBP is finding its way in new areas, for example, e-commerce or forced labor, or even the implementation of the $800 level for de minimis. CBP is really looking for the trade community to weigh in on their business practices, what works for them, what doesn't work, where they'd be at a competitive disadvantage. And so taking advantage of the opportunities for public engagement and comment is really important. The more informed that government is about the impact on the private sector, the better a decision it can make about how to meet policy goals. And I think for many of you, that's really important because you need the government requirements to work with your particular business model. And so while you may say, hey, I'm a one-man band, or I only have 3 people to focus on trade compliance in my shop, how in the world am I going to find time to advise CBP? That's for those COAC members. Take the time. It's important, because if something comes out that messes with your business model, you'll pay for it in the long run. So have the conversation and weigh in. Thanks, Betty.
You're welcome. What great pieces of advice for all of us. And it dovetails so well with what Carrie was talking about with compliance within a company, and Suzanne with going out to audit and to assess risk within companies too. So thank you so much for that. So now it's time we can take some questions, and I've got a few, but if the audience has some, feel free to type them into the chat box. And, if all of you want to take your put your microphones back on, I think that we can still continue the discussion in some way. Ray, feel free to join in too. So one of the questions I'm left with after hearing from all of you is, we know in the trade that forced labor is becoming a hot topic, right? Because all the signs are pointing that way, as Brenda has just pointed out. So as customs brokers and freight forwarders and as importers and exporters, how do we communicate to customs our concerns? And, Brenda, you suggested that we keep in close contact, right? So what should we be doing right now?
So I think there's a couple of avenues. I think probably the first one is, in fact, COACT, the Commercial Operations Advisory Committee. Karen was a great participant a couple of years ago, but there are representatives of the trade community that are really focused on understanding what CBP is trying to accomplish and focused on communicating back to CBP what, in fact, is the art of the possible. I think any input on your experience or your requirements fed to those COACT members, either directly or through your trade association, can be really helpful. I think the other opportunity is that CBP will, in, I hope, the not too distant future, update the regulations around how it manages forced labor. There will be an opportunity for public comment. Take that opportunity and weigh in.
Thank you. Suzanne, from your perspective, how do you start alerting your clients, right, to some of these concerns around an issue like forced labor and what the risks might entail?
Well, we do have monthly webinars that are complementary to the trade, and that's one way we help to get the word out. We also blog and we share information as it becomes available. I think when it comes to forced labor, one of the key things to recognize is it's appearing everywhere. It's part of CTPAT. It's part of free trade agreements. Now, as Ray mentioned, it's part of this new Innovation Act. It's being embedded in so many different pieces of the puzzle that it's important that everyone recognize it's not something that happened to another company. And also the Xinjiang region of China is interesting because this is the first time we've seen an identified region. And I think that should be a calling card to everyone. We're no longer looking at a single supplier or a single commodity. We're looking at complete regions that have been identified as such. So all of these things become part of an overall strategy to recognize that this is a growing issue. I think the call out to eliminate forced labor by 2025 globally is admirable, and it requires, though, an escalation of enforcement by default in order to eradicate it. So I think one last thing that came out of Customs Symposium last year was that from an enforcement perspective, Customs and Border Protection is the only customs agency globally who has the right to enforce at the border. All other countries rely on multiple government agencies to achieve this, but they're not specific to a shipment. So we're really moving forward in that respect, and think in the United States by saying we have those withhold release orders, and you're seeing other countries starting to look at this opportunity and to say, okay, we need to be making similar changes so that it's not just another agency that hears it and then it has to come back to the customs agency in the other countries. So I think it's a telltale sign of what we're seeing, where it's a telltale sign in terms of the legislation and also in the escalation. And there's only 4 years till that till that goal becomes real. So I would anticipate that we'll see much legislative changes in the next year.
Agreed, and great point. Carrie, from your perspective, for importers and exporters who are compliance managers within their organizations, right? How do you get the word out? And how do you kind of raise the flag and say, hey, we've got some issues that we need to consider?
Oh, sure. I use a number of methods, obviously. So first, I do send regular email updates to everyone that this touches in the company. I make sure it's at least monthly, but usually it's more than that. And then I do gather people together for meetings to discuss things like forced labor. I've had numerous meetings on that. And then, really try to work with them and try to get, get things in place, as a team there. So, and then, I also do, I share information that I learned from webinars and from, weekly Connect calls. I share that information as well. So.
It's why you're so good at getting buy-in from your stakeholders, right? That constant inclusion. Thank you. So I've got a question specifically for Brenda. Do you have any sense of how CBP might fold technology into the equation to better protect against forced labor in the supply chain? Or is there a way for the trade can get more information about CBP's ability to assess this option?
What we've seen with CBP's enforcement of the forced labor statute is a real evolution over the last 5 or 6 years. And one of the things that CBP, as it often does, has been looking at is how could it use technology? And I think in particular, it's interested in technology from 2 aspects. One is data analytics. As many of you know, CBP doesn't have resources to take on every single issue. And so it, as you all do, has to go by risk. And data and the analytics around data can really help gather information about either what other agencies have found, what other countries have found, what investigative reporters have found, and or trade patterns where a value issue may indicate that the cost of production is too low and there may be a labor cost issue there. So the data and analytics is one form of technology. The other form, I think, really goes to validation of origin. So if you think about Xinjiang cotton, for example, knowing that cotton actually came from Xinjiang versus cotton that may have been grown in India or in the US can help CBP to segment the population in a much more efficient way than looking through books and records. CBP understands that that technology has to provide results quickly and relatively cheaply, because it has to be cost effective to be able to use. But I think that's an area for further exploration. And there are a number of promising leads in that area that CBP is looking at.
Great, thank you so much. Suzanne, we've got a question for you. Do you see some commonalities in the auditing that you're doing?
It's always interesting. There's often standard operating procedures in place. And I say one commonality that we see frequently is it's kind of missing the who, what, when, where, and how. So for example, our company will perform this audit. If the SOP is going to be helpful, it needs to really indicate which department, and it should be by title. It should be very specific as to who's performing the function. So often we see when companies are unsure or they don't want to be tied down because they're still trying to develop their trade compliance, they'll put a very generic, our company will do this. And it doesn't really say how often. And, try to avoid that word periodic and be specific. It's either annual or, biannual or whatnot. But I think that's one concern. I think another interesting underutilized resource is becoming a trusted trader. Many people are in CTPAT and they have not taken the next step to become a trusted trader through the importer self-assessment program, which, having worked on all sides of the fence, originally for importers, exporters, brokers, forwarders, if I were to jump back on the import export side, that would be my priority, to partner with the government to reduce the risk, to be taken out of the pool of companies that can be audited under a focused assessment. You know, interestingly, if we took this parallel program and said to a company, there's this ISA program and you can't be audited by the IRS, they would be all over it. But we say, oh, you can't be audited by customs under a focused assessment. And they're like, you know, well, that's interesting. So I think partnership is missing directly to the highest levels possible, where the greatest benefits come from. So I would definitely, you know, push the partnership program and become a trusted trader.
Good advice. Thank
Suzanne,
you.
Suzanne agreed, 150%.
Thought Brenda might agree with that one. Carrie, there's a question for you. If for someone who's not used to working in the ACE portal, is there training available?
Yes, and why don't I, actually Customs has a lot of training information available, and I can actually share a link in the chat box for anyone who's interested.
That would be great.
That same page has a link for signing up for CSMS messages if folks aren't already signed up. So.
That's great. Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question, and we've got one for Ray. Well, we started with Ray and we will end with Ray with questions. So Ray, other than the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, since the rhetoric around it seems a bit fraught, do you see any other pathways for renewal of GSP or MTB?
Thanks, Betty, and thanks for the question. I think it's going to be tough. There's a reason that GSP was allowed to expire at the end of the year and that the MTB was not re-upped. I think both bills face unique challenges, and then there's a general challenge that they both face. On the unique side, the MTB, there are a number of provisions in the House where members have objected for various reasons, maybe on behalf of a constituent or some other reason. And until all of those objections are resolved, and that's a work in progress, I'm not sure that you're going to see something move forward. Although I think that when the Senate took up their bill last week, it sort of forced the hand of House Ways and Means, and they are apparently going to introduce a bill today. On GSP, there was disagreement between Democrats and Republicans. And I hate to make it a partisan thing. It's just how the world is divided, unfortunately. But Democrats want to increase, enhance the labor and environmental standards. Republicans don't necessarily want to do that. You could argue that the Wyden and Crapo bill, being bipartisan, sort of hit it down the middle. And maybe that's right, because you see the House Democrats saying it doesn't go far enough. The fact is that all sides, both sides of the Capitol, both parties are going to have to agree on something in order to get this through, because it's going to need 60 votes in the Senate. Anything you want to pass in the Senate requires 60 votes, which means you need 10 Republicans on board. And so I think from a political perspective, the Senate bill may be the baseline. And although the China bill is sort of fraught with all sorts of other issues, it is a vehicle that was taken up and passed by the Senate. They got well more than 10 Republicans on board. I still think it's going to take some time to see how this all shakes out. Again, you'll see a press release out of Ways and Means today that says they introduced their own bill. It doesn't mean that we're anywhere near resolution here, but I think we can get there. It's just going to take some time. And I should also point out that when GSP is extended, it's going to be done retroactively. I find it hard to believe Congress wouldn't do that. I know Brenda's shaking her head. I guess I point to 2015 when they extended it retroactively after it was expired for 23 months. And then we thought it was crazy. Once you got past the 12-month mark, I think people got very, very concerned. And that's the problem with GSP. There's not a lot of urgency. Members do assume it will be extended retroactively. And so they say, well, these companies will get their money back. We can get around to it later, while they underappreciate the administrative burden it puts on the trade, on customs, and what this means for small businesses who are in the process of deferring investments and laying people off. So that's a very long answer, and not necessarily an answer to the question itself, but it's complicated, and Congress is not good with complicated, and that's why these things take time.
Well, our world is complicated, right? The world of international trade is complicated, and that's why it was so good to hear from you, Ray, and Carrie, and Brenda, and Suzanne. Between all of you, or among all of you, you gave us some really practical advice for best practices, for channeling the resources that we do have available to us, to those areas that we should prioritize in terms of compliance. So I thank all of you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure, and it's been impactful and very educational.
Yeah, really well done. Thanks, everyone. It was a terrific presentation, and thanks to all of our attendees as well. We appreciate you joining us, and we appreciate your participation. I'd like to just thank again our sponsor for today's event, New England Duty Drawback Specialists. Point everyone once again to CONECT's website. Take a look at our upcoming events, the Boston Port Tour on August 18th, and our Trade and Transportation Conference from December 7th through the 9th. We hope that you will join us on our next Tuesday morning, 10 a.m. Call for our members. And once again, Ray, Brenda, Suzanne, Carrie, Betty, well done, bravo. Thank you very much. And I hope everyone else has a terrific afternoon. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Ron.
Bye.